Thank you so much, Irini, for inviting me. It is wonderful to be here with you and to share my thoughts on the topic of my dissertation. I completed this dissertation a while ago, and hopefully it will be published soon in a monograph. So let's start with what we see right in front of us. Those of you who had the opportunity to visit maybe Vatican and the museum, maybe you are familiar with this specific um, work from Raphael. Rarely can someone marveling at Raphael's Homer, famously flanked by Dante Alighieri and Virgil in the Parnassos, adorning the stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican Palace, come to realize that one of the earliest admirers of this masterpiece of the Italian High Renaissance was in all probability a charismatic scholar from Greece, to whom we owe the first printed rendition of the Iliad in a modern language. Born at the dawn of the eventful 16th century, the Cinquecento of the startling transatlantic discoveries, the ceaseless Italian wars, the vociferous emergence of the Protestant Reformation, and the unrelenting Ottoman advance into European territory, Nikolaos Loukanes, like so many of his erudite compatriots residing in flourishing cities in the West, appears to have ardently devoted himself to humanist intellectual endeavors aimed at instigating a revival of classical literature. Of course, at the same time, he was responding to an unremitting longing to keep alive in the hearts of his fellow Greeks the empowering legacy of their illustrious ancestors. Let's stop for a minute and ponder. Was there a need for a revival of classical literature, and for whom? Let's turn to a leading scholar and poet of the early Italian Renaissance, who is often credited with initiating the 14th century Italian Renaissance and the founding of Renaissance humanism. You may all recognize here Petrarch, right? And when Petrarch received a manuscript of the Iliad from a Byzantine correspondent in 1354, what did he say? Can I have a volunteer who will be reading what he said? You can find it here. Okay? Your Homer. Okay,
I'm
yes.
happy to volunteer.
Okay, I believe we already have a volunteer, a first volunteer. Okay, please. You may start reading. I cannot clearly see the names, Irene, so maybe you can help me and I can see all the participants.
Something, I don't see them all either, but
Ah, really?
yeah.
Or maybe, you know what, Irene, maybe
Yeah.
you
Shall I read it?
Yes, with your wonderful voice.
Your Homer is mute to me, or rather, I am deaf to him. Still, I rejoice even to look at him, and often as I embrace him, I say, sighing, "O great man, how ardently would I listen to you."
Isn't it amazing?
Yes.
Your Homer is mute to me. So I have a manuscript, but still I cannot understand it. Unlike the West, where another professed eyewitness account of the Trojan War had totally overshadowed Homer's linguistically abstruse narrative, The expressive power of Homeric Greek never ceased to preoccupy erudite intellectuals in the Byzantine East. Authors like Evstathios of Thessaloniki and other scholars zealously took upon themselves the laborious task of producing extensive commentaries and exegetical works on the Homeric epics. And here we can see Evstathios of Thessaloniki. This is his commentary. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention Venetus A, the most famous manuscript of the Homeric Iliad from the 10th century. And if we need to thank someone for this manuscript, who do you think it is? Cardinal Bessarion. Venetus A came into the possession of a renowned Greek scholar and book collector. This is Cardinal Bessarion. In 1468, Bessarion donated his library to the Republic of Venice. And by preserving so many Greek texts, Bessarion became one of those most influential on the revival of Greek literature during the Renaissance. Has anyone visited the Biblioteca Marziana in Venice? Irene, have you? I'm sure, So when you visit this library, whenever I visit, I feel so grateful to Cardinal Bessarion because this is his library, right? And thanks to his efforts, we have all these works. Throughout its millennial history, Byzantium continued to view Homer as the educator par excellence, and thus Homer retained a revered title, which ironically had been accorded to him by no other than the fierce opponent of poetry, Plato. If in the West, Homer's epics extended well beyond the reading competencies of even accomplished scholars and poets, as we have seen, in the East, Homer still formed the backbone of the curriculum, read as he was daily by schoolboys and surreptitiously by schoolgirls, like the future author of the memorable Alexiad, Anna Komnene, in the 12th century, who, forbidden by her parents from studying classical literature, had recourse to unofficial lessons from court eunuchs. Indeed, it is interesting to see that in Byzantium it was customary for students to learn Homer by heart at school, much like Nikiratos in Xenophon's Symposium. Michael Psellos, an intellectual and court philosopher who lived in the 11th century, could have also gloated over his ability to recite by heart the whole Iliad, a work that he had reportedly covered in its entirety by the age of 9. How does that make you feel? Being able to recite the entire Iliad when he was 9. That's impressive. All that in Byzantium, So thus far we have seen that there was a need for a revival of classical literature in the West. We can then understand why Pope Leo X was so willing to support financially an institution such as the Gymnasio Mediceo. And Gymnasio Mediceo, this is our author's school, Nikolaos Loukanes' school. The young author, a few things about the author. The young author, who was just in his 20s when he produced his adaptation of the Iliad, was born in all probability on the island of Zakynthos, sometime between 1502 and 1504, and he belonged to the first cluster of students of the gymnasium. Unlike the Pontifical Greek College of St. Athanasios, founded in 1577 with a stridently proselytizing mission, the Gymnasio founded in Rome in 1514 by the humanist Pope Leo X had the sole purpose of fostering Greek studies in Italy. A letter dispatched on the Pope's behalf to Markos Moussouros by the papal secretary Pietro Bembo eloquently describes the philosophy of the school. The renowned Cretan Hellenist is asked to bring from Greece 10 or 12, or indeed as many as he wishes, young fellows of plentiful intellectual abilities and of a morally good disposition, as it was believed that through their instruction, the Latins could gain a more advanced and comprehensive grasp of Greek. The students could thus contribute to the long-awaited revival of Greek studies in Italy. But if for the Pope, the school had an unmistakably humanist scope, the person who was entrusted with the task of recruiting its first students, Markos Moussouros, along with his mentor Ianos Laskares, who had in the first place envisioned the foundation of such a school, equally foregrounded its capacity to galvanize the young pupils' patriotism. And here we can see Markos Moussouros and Ianos Laskares as well. Well, I am sure that most of you are familiar with the Erasmian pronunciation, right? And Erasmus, you will be excited to hear, Erasmus was the student of Markos Moussouros. Markos Moussouros was a renowned Hellenist. So, according to the dedicatory epistle to Ianos Laskares, with which Moussouros prefaces his 1516 edition of Pausanias, in Greek we say Pausanias, the neophyte scholars were expected in due course to requite their benefactor with works in prose and verse, proclaiming the glory of Laskaris' Ianos and exalting the virtue of his ancestors, the most honorable emperors of Greece. At this point, we should mention that the ancestors of Ianos Laskaris, they were indeed emperors in the Byzantine Empire. It has been astutely observed that though carefully couched in encomiastic terms, and specifically referring to Laskaris' noble lineage, this can also be taken as an implicit reference to the Ianos of the Greeks in general, whose illustrious heritage they shared and were called to promulgate. One should not forget that in 1514, the year when the school started its operation, hopes for a crusade against the Ottomans were running high, and Greek scholars in Italy such as Laskaris and Moussouros, who were privileged to enjoy the personal acquaintance and friendship of the Pope, felt an overwhelming urge to exhort the already eager pontifex to unite the Christian powers in an expedition against the Ottomans. It is against this backdrop of relative optimism concerning Eastern affairs that the formal salutations addressed to Pope Leo X by the newly arrived students should be read. And here I will also need a volunteer very shortly. Here we can also see a woodcut from Loukanes' Iliad. And I want Irene to guess the scene from the Iliad that it accompanies.
Would that be Thetis?
Oh, yes.
Supplicating Zeus.
Exactly. Exactly. But Irene, isn't it amazing how you see that, the way the arms of Thetis are, this is something that intrigued me. And I realized that this is a symbol of humility, of being humble. And this is something that has been used in Byzantium, in many icons. So, on February 1514, the newly admitted students were formally introduced to the Pope in a welcome ceremony that was meticulously orchestrated by Laskares. Loukanes' salutation allows us to listen, if only for a fleeting moment, to the possibly faltering voice of a young boy who was about to pay his respects to the Pope for the first time. I can read in Greek, and Irene, if you want to read the translation
Yes.
in English. Λέοντα, Θεού εικόν εείς ελευθερείς πρόμον εκθεσφάτων Ελλάς πέμπει με προσιπήν.
Leo, image of God, Greece, as decreed by God, sends me to address you as the foremost guardian of her freedom.
The idea that the Pope could wield the immense influence of his spiritual authority to unite all the Christian powers in an expedition against the Ottomans was hardly new. In the years immediately preceding Loukanes' birth, the Second Ottoman-Venetian War had turned Zakynthos into a major safe haven for refugees arriving from the captured nearby cities of Nafpaktos, Methoni, and Koroni. But still, no concerted attempt to halt the seemingly inexorable Ottoman advance was in sight. A series of fierce wars for control over Italy, known as the Italian Wars, had plunged Europe into a seething political and military maelstrom, with immeasurable consequences not only for Western, but also, much to the consternation of Greek scholars, for Eastern affairs. In 1508, Ianos Laskares, who had been appointed as the French ambassador to the Serenissima, had prepared a detailed plan for a crusade. But on the eve of the League of Cambrai, with its disastrous outcome for the Republic of Venice, the timing couldn't have been more inopportune. It was not until the elevation of Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, Leo X, to the papal throne on March 19 in 1513 that hopes for the liberation of Greece were imbued with new life and vitality. So this is about the context. And now it is time to get a glimpse of Loukanes' 1526 patriotically imbued Iliad. This Renaissance epos is a condensed version of the original, written in a so-called κοινή γλώσσα, a common language, which shouldn't be confused with Hellenistic κοινή. It is written in pairs of trochaic octosyllables, and it is addressed to a wider, mainly Greek-speaking audience residing in the Greek East or abroad. Uh, so what happens here is that, and what is very important to highlight, is that Loukanes remains very close to the original. He offers a synopsis of its content, covering the basic events of each book when he cannot cover certain sections of the Iliad. And he is very faithful to the original. Given the author's marked predilection for precision, it is all the more surprising to see that his rendition swerves considerably from its source in one thing. And what is that? This is the representation of the Trojans and the Achaeans. In the remaining part of this presentation, I will offer an example of Loukanes' willfully denigrating portrayal of the enemies. Of course, there are many more, but the brevity of this presentation would not allow me to discuss all the instances. Suffice it to say that the Trojans are portrayed as barbarians. In gouging the possible motives underpinning the author's metaphrastic choices, I will attempt to elucidate the significance of theories developed already in the medieval times and widely revived during the Renaissance period regarding the origins of the Turks and the alleged association of the latter with the Trojans. Finally, I will conclude the analysis by proposing that Loukanes is retrojecting the rivalry and animosity that existed between the Greeks and the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century into the decidedly un-jingoistic heroic past reflected in the Iliad. Early on in his work, we see here, this is Book 2. The author introduces the opponent's territory as the land of the barbarians. When King Agamemnon, addressing the assembly of the Achaeans, appears despondent over the failure of his army's 9-year endeavor to capture the city of Troy. While Homer's Agamemnon speaks with reverence and awe of the well-peopled city of Ilion, the same hero in Loukanes' Iliad has nothing but contempt for the land of the barbarians. So you can see how Loukanes is already in Book 2 calling them barbarians, and I want us just to take a look at the original here. So once again, I can read in Greek, and Irene, can you?
Yes.
The translation. Okay, so this is Book 2, 130 to 133. Al epikuri, and forgive me for my Greek accent and pronunciation, and not the Erasmian. In Greece, this is how we read ancient Greek. Al epikuri, πολέων εκ πολίων εγχέσπαλοι άνδρες έασιν, ή με μέγα πλάζουσι και ούκ ιός εθέλοντα ηλίου εκπέρσε, εφ νεόμενον πτολίεθρον.
But there are allies from many cities, men who wield the spear, who hinder me greatly, and though I wish it, do not allow me to sack the well-peopled city of Ilios.
The well-peopled city of Ilios. Ακριβώς, exactly. So here we are confronted with a largely post-Herodotian distinction between civilized Greeks and uncouth foreigners that is anachronistically applied to the temporally elusive, legendary world of heroes that is so imaginatively recreated by Homer in his epic. As we may recall, in the Iliad, the epithet varvaros is used only once. This is Iliad 2:867 for the Carians, in the compound form varvarophony, to denote merely a linguistic difference. So in Homer's Iliad, you will not encounter varvary as a word. In Constantine Hermoniakos's 14th century rendition of the Trojan story, from which Nikolaos Loukanes borrows profusely in certain sections of his work, the roles are reversed. In a scene where some of the most despicable Trojan War atrocities are poignantly described, the epithet varvary is applied to the Greeks. It is also worth noting that Hermoniakos's version does not include any pejorative remarks whatsoever about the Trojans. So this is Hermoniakos, Konstantinos Hermoniakos. He lived in the 14th century. He's a Byzantine author. And we can see that in his work, the Greeks are called barbarians in certain sections. So what is intriguing is that Hermoniakos's work is indeed a work from which Loukanes borrows a lot. He borrows profusely. So what I couldn't understand was the rationale. Why is Loukanes deciding to do something entirely different in his own Iliad? So why is Loukanes so willing to veer away from both of his main sources, and these main sources are the Iliad and Constantine Hermoniakos's work, in his depiction of the Trojans? Is he wittingly investing the Trojan legend with an incipient national sentiment? Does his view of the present color his perception of the past? And why do the inhabitants of the famed fortress town of Hisarlik in his work bear an uncanny resemblance to the Ottoman Turks? 15th century theories on the origins of the Turks, drawing on material from the medieval chronicle tradition, will greatly help to elucidate all these questions. The story of the Turks' alleged Trojan origins goes back to the late 7th century and has its roots in a Latin chronicle which is commonly ascribed to a fictitious author, Fredegar. According to the legend, attested for the first time in this source, after the fall of Troy and during the ensuing flight from the famed city, Trojan refugees were split into two groups. The first group fled to Macedon and through intermingling with the pre-existing local population, gave rise to the people of the Macedonian kingdom of Philip II and Alexander the Great. The second, meanwhile, meandered for many years through Asia Minor before finally settling in Europe under the leadership of King Frankio, a potentate these people had elected for themselves. Following the description of the birth of the Frankish nation, the account centers on the peregrinations of a sub-branch of the previous group, which, deciding to secede from the main body of the Franks and designating its own sovereign, Torquatus, eventually anchored itself along the banks of the Danube between the ocean and Thrace. On the basis of Fredegar's report, these are the forebears of the nation of the Torki. Now, though it is quite precarious to argue that the author intended to refer to any historical Turkic people, and despite the fact that Fredegar's tale was largely eclipsed by subsequent chronicles, which wished to wholly dispense with the idea of any Trojan cousins of the Franks, the semi-dormant theory of the Trojan pedigree of the Turks held on tenaciously until the Renaissance. To be sure, by that point, the majority of humanists seriously engaged in historiographic work strenuously rejected any such connection, promoting in its stead the theory of a Scythian descent of the Turks, which was entirely in keeping with the prevalent contemporary conceptualization of the Ottomans. And at this point, I should mention that this is exactly how Byzantine authors would often talk about the Turks, that they were Scythians or sometimes even Persians. Foremost among them was the prolific author Enea Silvio Piccolomini, Pope Pius, who upon ascending the papal throne in 1458 fully devoted himself to arduous preparations for an ambitious crusade project, which, much to his distress, would never materialize. His writings, the writings of Pius, are brimming with reproaches against those who irresponsibly refer to the Turks as Teucri, the name by which the Trojans were widely known in the West through Virgil's Aeneid. Aside from the tenuous medieval evidence, there were mainly three reasons why these ethnonyms were often used interchangeably. The first, pertaining to an unmistakable phonetic resemblance between the names Turki and Tefkri. The second, to the humanist penchant for achieving an authentic antique style, purged of barbaric neologisms. And the third, you may guess it, to the identity of the Turks' power base in Asia Minor. To be sure, not all humanists employing the term Teucri for the Turks were doing so because they were intent on making a statement about the true origins of the latter. What about those instances, however, where the Turks were explicitly portrayed as relentless avengers who, by capturing Constantinople, were requiting the grave injustices inflicted upon Troy in eras long gone? The notion is tangibly reflected in numerous accounts of the fall of Constantinople. So now we will talk about some accounts of the fall of Constantinople, which happened in 1453. Filippo da Rimini, for example, the Venetian chancellor of the island of Corfu, in his description of Constantinople's siege, narrated how upon entering Constantinople, the Sultan defiled a Greek virgin who had taken refuge in the church of Hagia Sophia. And why did he do that? In retaliation for Cassandra's rape by the Locrian Ajax. Speculating on the veracity of such statements is not always easy. On many occasions, the downfall of Troy and the ensuing sufferings of its inhabitants were thought to be the perfect foil for the atrocities committed during the sack of Constantinople, and therefore authors were inclined to employ the Trojan analogy mainly as a rhetorical device to dramatically accentuate the poignancy of the demise of the Byzantine Empire. Here we have another text. This is the Responsio Magni Turci. The Responsio Magni Turci, what is it? It is a spurious epistolary poem purportedly composed by Mehmed II in response to an authentic letter written by Pius II for the purpose of evangelizing the Grand Turk, and this response further encapsulates the essence of the theory of the Trojan origins of the Turks. In this highly imaginative piece of anti-papal propaganda, the Sultan expostulates with the Pope, protesting that the Trojan heritage should not be monopolized by Pius. And once again, and this is your last chance, if you want to volunteer to read this exciting epistolary poem. Although I know Irene really wants to read it too.
Shall I go then?
Of course, Irene.
You have said it is impossible for me to be a Dardanian by birth, nor have you blushed to call me a Turk. I am a Teucrian, born of Teucrian blood. Why, Pius, do you call me a Turk throughout your poem? Tell me, who was Teucer, and then who was Turkis? Father, we are Trojans, whatever you may think. We are were the remnants of the nation of Priam, whom the Greek generals could not destroy in their cruel war. History tells us how powerful in war the Dardanians were. You should read your history.
Oh my God. You can see here that many people wanted to claim that, that descent. They all wanted to identify at some point in Europe with the Trojans. So the Turks' right to their putative Trojan patrimony is asserted, as you can see, in the most forceful way. Taken at face value, this claim would seem to imply that the Ottoman sovereign truly entertained the belief that the Turks derived their pedigree from the Trojans. Would the Quattrocento audience, however, interpret it in such a way? An exhaustive discussion of the motives underpinning the humanist infatuation with the Turco-Trojan legend lies outside the purview of this presentation. Regardless of whether the Quattrocento authors were convinced of the validity of the Turks' Trojan ancestry or not, there is one thing that remains certain. The notion enjoyed considerable popularity throughout the 15th century, especially among scholars who wished to infuse a distinct antiquarian tone into their accounts of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. Ubertino Puskolo's epic poem Constantinopolis, composed around 1455, offers a wonderful example of how the past was projected onto the present, since its hexameters are filled with references to the Turks as Tefkri and to the Greeks as Homeric Danae. If the Brescian humanist was apt to invoke the myth of the Trojan War in order to amplify the calamities visited upon Constantinople, was Nikolaos Loukanes reversely transposing the post-1453 Greco-Ottoman conflict into a more glorious, mythical setting with a view to inciting his fellow countrymen to emulate the sublime bravery of their forefathers? The above analysis has provided an example of how Loukanes' portrayal of the Trojans differs considerably from the Homeric account. Against the backdrop of continuing association of the Turks with the Trojans, these disparaging appellations, for which we find no parallel whatsoever in the Iliadic tradition, may be regarded as emblematic of an endeavor to graft the opposition between the post-Byzantine Greeks and the Ottoman Turks onto that between the Achaeans and the Trojans. In proudly identifying with the illustrious forebears, the Achaeans, and in evincing so pronounced a hostility toward the ostensible offspring of the Trojans, the Ottomans, Loukanes seems to echo the views espoused by some of the most influential members of the Byzantine intelligentsia in Italy, like Ianos Laskares and Markos Moussouros, with whom he was personally connected during his years at the Gymnasio Mediceo. These intellectuals were fervent supporters of the idea that the pontiff could wield the influence of his spiritual authority to unite all the Christian powers in an expedition against the Turks, and did not miss any opportunity to proclaim in the most emphatic way the resolute willingness of the enslaved Greeks to recall their ancient virtues and to forcefully attack the enemy from within in order to behold the light of freedom, shining once again on the Byzantine city. And I'm using here some expressions that Markos Moussouros is using in one of his works. It is not known whether Loukanes' Iliad was primarily intended to galvanize its readers into action, inciting them to support the cause of a crusade against the Ottomans, but even if it did, the timing could not have been more unfortunate. During the uneasy summer of 1526, only a few months after the publication of Loukanes' Iliad, the heavily defeated members of the anti-imperialist League of Cognac, deeply enmeshed in the ongoing conflict for domination over Italy, hardly had time to make plans about how to wrest Greece free from the Ottoman shackles. And if I may, if we have just maybe one more minute, I want to share with you some lines from Seamus Heaney, and maybe you are familiar with Seamus Heaney. He is one of Ireland's greatest poets, and he won a Nobel Prize in Literature. So in his work, The Cure at Troy, which is a version of Sophocles' Philoctetes, we see these lines here, the verses. History says, don't hope on the side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. I just want to remind you that during the time where my author lived, Nikolaos Loukanes, unfortunately, hope and history didn't rhyme. And I believe that this is the reason why he was trying to, express himself using these epithets for the Trojans. But we all want to go back to the Homeric original, where they are portrayed as brave warriors, right? And where we have Hector as the preeminent hero. Thank you so much once again, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. So much to think about. I'm going to stop the recording now and then take any questions that anyone wants to pose. You can put them in the chat. You can put them in the comments if you're watching later. And